Well, hello everyone. Welcome again. My name is Carmen Mazzara, and I serve as Executive Director of the Coalition for American Public Diplomacy and Leadership, or as we typically call it, CAPDL. For those of you who are CAPDL members, welcome back to another great one of our sessions that we're using to explore how you can best make the case for the powerful BridgeUSA programs that we have. I hope you were able to join us for our look at how these programs relate to prosperity and how they relate to public diplomacy. And I'm really excited to talk to you all about how they relate to US national security. For those of you who don't know CAPDL yet, we are the community for the worldwide ecosystem around the BridgeUSA programs. We have members who work in country, recruiting participants and supporting them once they're alumni, agents, sponsors, host families, host businesses, camps, community advocates, local coordinators, and everybody in between. For those of you who aren't yet part of the CAPDL family, please come on in. We would absolutely love to have you join us in this effort. Our work really centers around education and best practices sharing and storytelling to help strengthen and expand these programs that we know deliver so much, both for participants as well as for US interests. I know we have a wonderful mix of folks today, some of whom know the national security side really well, some of whom know the BridgeUSA side really well. Just to make sure, if you're not as familiar with BridgeUSA as you're going to be in about 45 minutes, here is a brief overview on the CAPDL website of all 13 J1 categories. Look at it now. We promise we won't distract you too much as you read. But I also want to make sure that folks who have not yet become part of the CAPDL family will know that after this session, it just takes about 5 minutes to come on in, and we're able to support you with lots of resources, great events like this, and that broader community that you can be a part of with all of those wonderful voices from all around the world. So I'm really excited for our conversation today. And again, we'll have this as part of a longer series of ways that we're helping you make the case for BridgeUSA. But we have two great speakers who are going to answer a few questions from me. And then after they've had a chance to do that, we're going to open it up to all of you. So if there's something you desperately want to have talked about or answered, please feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll get to it after our speakers have had a chance to share some of their thoughts. We are joined today by Sonya Finley, who is a professor of national security strategy at the National War College. She's also a professor at the Georgetown University Security Studies program. She retired as a U.S. Army colonel after a 26-year career with assignments as a strategist and strategic advisor, planner, and speechwriter for uniformed leaders in Korea, Iraq, and D.C., as well as the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy. She's a former East-West Center Fellow and a former term member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and we're very excited that she agreed to be part of this conversation today. She's joined by Mark Jacobson, who is currently a senior fellow at the Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy at Salve, Regina University. Mark has over 25 years of experience in the US government, international organizations, and academia, working on what he calls some of the most complex and politically sensitive national security issues facing the United States. As I look at his career, he's been a policymaker, a diplomat, an academic, and a uniformed member of the US military. Previously, he was Vice President of Research, Evaluation, and Modernizing Government at the Partnership for Public Service. I got to know Mark when he was Assistant Dean at the Syracuse University Maxwell School Program in Washington, D.C., but he's also held appointments as Senior Advisor to the Secretary of Defense and Special Assistant to the Secretary of the Navy. He served in Kabul, Afghanistan as the first Deputy NATO Representative and Director of International Affairs for ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force. He's worked at the U.S. Senate and many other parts of the international security apparatus around the United States, including 24 years as a military reservist with both the U.S. Army and Navy and active duty mobilizations in Bosnia and Afghanistan. So as you all can see, we have two wonderful speakers who really know the international security side and are going to really share with us the BridgeUSA side. So I'm excited to jump in. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. If you have any technical issues, please feel free to send me a message and we'll be able to jump right in. So my first question, and Sonya, I'm going to start with you. What is soft power? How is it working to advance U.S. national security? And then how do programs like Bridge USA deliver on soft power projection?
Okay, three part. Hi, and thank you so much, Carmen. Her energy is infectious, and I'm super excited to be here with everyone today. So kind of three things, three parts in your question, so three parts to my answer. And I'll start with what I do on a day-to-day basis, kind of national security, right? So national security is this broad concept about protecting our nation's security or stability and our well-being, from economics to energy to domestic, and then also defense, right? Where both Mark and I have backgrounds in that as well. And the United States, as a government, we have lots of tools that we can use. And some of those tools that we can think of as soft power, right? Those are tools that we can use to help achieve our goal by attracting others rather than coercing or paying others for their support. And political scientist Joseph Nye, who just passed away last week, actually, he coined this phrase soft power, right? And it resides in a nation's cultural and political values, as well as their policies, as long as they're attractive. But states, we don't control, the authorities do not control culture or values. That lives within the people and how they live their daily lives, right? And so then that gives us back to your specific question about Bridge USA and these short-term exchanges. These short-term exchanges can really enhance America's attractiveness by exposing participants to average Americans all over the country. So they can see that the United States is a lot more than just what they might see in the news or on the media. Right? And so in that way, these short-term exchanges, they can help us do connections, make participants more familiar, more attractive, identify ways that we have these connections and empathies and other things, and that can ultimately enhance our national security.
Thank you. Mark, any thoughts?
You'd think after 7 years of doing this, I would know where the mute button is. But no, I think to put it a different way, I mean, in terms of U.S. soft power, think of things like Coca-Cola and Hollywood, things that make us attractive to the world that aren't about what we get in return necessarily. It's about demonstrating that our values, our educational systems, our way of life are positive. I mean, we're trying to make it more attractive and trying to make our nation more influential globally, without the need, as Sonya said, for any sort of coercion. And I think that's where there's such value in programs like this.
Thank you. And Mark, there's obviously a lot of misunderstandings sometimes about the United States. Could you talk about how those misunderstandings might impact national security and then how Bridge USA might help decode the US in some ways?
Sure. If we think about promoting democratic values or advancing our economic interests, it's easy for us to be misunderstood. Let's say we're trying to increase our trade partnerships or business collaborations. Others might see it as imperialism. People need to understand a familiarity with how markets and business practices work in the United States. Democratic values, that we are trying to inspire democratic reforms rather than force them on people. And look, we've made mistakes historically. We think back to now over 20 years ago, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, ostensibly because of weapons of mass destruction. But then there was also this issue of, well, we want to bring democracy to Iraq. Well, that's not always the case. The United States learns that there are better ways of doing this, and we have to make sure that people understand that there are there are potentially inspiring ways of helping to strengthen democratic movements worldwide. Likewise, it's in the United States' interest to create future leaders, but we want people to know that, look, we understand that by bringing people on an exchange program, this may help them become more influential leaders in their home countries, but they don't have to, there's no quid pro quo. You don't have to maintain a pro-American policy perspective on everything you do. We just know that naturally these exchange programs are going to allow people to understand the U.S. better. And this really gets to the decoding piece. I think that personal exposure to Americans and American society can really dispel negative stereotypes. and foreign propaganda, and really help people to understand and have a more nuanced and positive perception of the United States. This is particularly important in understanding regional differences. You know, Los Angeles and Southern California have their own views on foreign policy. The Pacific Northwest more concerned with the Arctic than perhaps Florida is. You know, Florida more in tune with making sure that tourists are coming from Brazil to go to Disney World. And of course, New York City alone has its own foreign policy. So I think having people understand these regional differences, and most important, being able to put concepts or ideas or names with faces. And we know that personal interaction builds understanding and empathy so that people who come to the United States and visit and meet other people can say, well, wait, in so many ways, they're like me. And that transcends borders. And I think overall, that can really help to counter anti-American sentiment that's based on misunderstanding.
Sonya, any of your thoughts?
Sure. So I'll pick up on the regional, start from there, and then go in a slightly different direction. I teach at the National Defense University, and we have a lot of international fellows, so military officers that come with their families for a year. So a little bit longer than some of these shorter term exchange programs. But one of the things that we do with these officers is they almost every month they go to a different part of the United States. They'll go visit Montana. They go out to San Francisco. They do homestays with people in Tennessee. They visit Detroit. You know, some of their trips have actually inspired me and my family to go different places in the United States that we have never been. Like finally I hit Montana, right? But they do that to really appreciate the mosaic that the United States is. Again, and to get back to Mark's point, to get beyond just the stereotypes. One of the things we also do too, and I think to alleviate kind of the misunderstandings is, again, if folks abroad are just watching the United States on the news, frankly, in some ways, we can look like we're a hot mess right now, right? We've got decision making and dramatic policy changes and other things. But one of the things that doesn't come across in the news is that our government, our own democratic process, was designed to be messy. It was designed to pit factions on factions. There's a James Madison quote for all of the American politics scholars out there, right? In recognition that the United States is filled with so many different perspectives and so many different interests. Right? And so we have a political system that often looks really messy, but it's purposely designed to let all of those different viewpoints be aired out and to kind of grind slowly towards decision making. So I think some of the misunderstandings is people look at the United States and they think, oh, look at their decision making. Like Congress can't get stuff together or Congress can't work with the president. And that's kind of, at least, but institutionally, it's in part by design to slow things down and to open up all of the apertures to all these different interests. And so I'd link it back to why it's even important to undo these misunderstandings or how these short-term exchange programs can help is that now looking abroad, around the world, so many more countries, the people are really exerting a much more influence within their own political decision making, right? So average people abroad are really engaging in their own political processes, whatever types of governments that they have, whether it's democratization or even kind of populism in different areas. So their feelings towards the United States, if they're based on misunderstandings, that can really affect the other country's foreign policies. So the more exchanges we can do, the more people we can bring into the United States for short-term exchanges to experience these regional kind of differences that Mark's mentioned with, and to appreciate why our democratic processes work the way they do, the logic behind them. Maybe that will alleviate some of those misunderstandings, which will enhance kind of diplomatic to diplomatic negotiations and relationships. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And I think that idea that exposure breeds familiarity and understanding is such a key part of why we all do this key work. both of you have talked about empathy and both of you have talked about nuance. And not everybody usually thinks of those as tools in the arsenal of national security, right? They think of tanks and they think of missile launchers and RPGs. Would each of you briefly touch on how a nuanced understanding and empathy really are part of the national security strategy or should be part of the national security strategy of the US? And Sonya, since you're nodding, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. So long, long ago, Greek historian Herodotus, he talked about nomos is king. Culture is king, right? The way people understand themselves and the world around them is based on the frames they have of how they live their life. And so, from ancient Greek times where they realize, cultures may have similar values expressed very differently in different norms and different ways of life. But at the core, they all may all, respect their elders in different ways, whatever the value is. And so I think these person-to-person interactions, more than just projection and more than just kind of monologue, when you have these dialogues and you have the chance for people to interact in kind of organic situations during different exchanges, whether it's a professional exchange or an educational exchange, when people are just organically interacting with one another, break down those stereotypes and make them realize the ways that what we have, the similarities we would have, I'd say, as opposed to the differences. The difference are easy to observe in different cultural habits and things, but at the core, we might all be living by the same principles. And one more little historical reference for let Mark jump in. After World War II ended, Eleanor Roosevelt was named to be the chairwoman on the committee looking for the universal human rights. Right? And what came out of it was the United Nations Declaration of Universal Human Rights in 1948. And at least, I've read about it. I haven't actually seen the studies, but the studies that they did and the group that she put together, they ostensibly went around and looked at everything from socialist societies to Islamic societies and Chinese societies and Western European Anglo societies. And they determined, hey, we really do have universal values. We have things that are in common. Again, living very different lives. So there's that foundation. So it's those interactions that can really help us realize those, which develops the empathy and does all the goodness in the world the way Mark talked about. Over to you, Mark.
Oh no, it's funny you say that because I remember not just from graduate school, but even in my early years in Washington, there was this huge debate between classical realists who said, "Don't let sentiment override strategic calculation. States have to prioritize their own interests. Excessive empathy can lead to dangerous miscalculations." But that was sort of tempered with a more liberal optimism that, look, if you can better understand others' suffering, then you can have more peaceful international relations. Now, let's get to the nuance in that. I mean, in my world, and again, not just as a civilian, but also a quarter of a century as a military officer and enlisted, empathy really helps you as an intelligence analyst or a policymaker understand your potential adversaries, their motivations, the grievances, the cultural context. I think to Afghanistan alone, where understanding that the Pashtuns who made up the Taliban truly felt their central government, truly felt disenfranchised from their central government. If you didn't understand that, you couldn't even get started on trying to come up with solutions, whether they be political, social, or military. And then it also, I think, empathy, and we can look to today's world. When you have leaders who can empathetically engage with your allies' concerns and perspectives, I think you build more resilient partnerships. Otherwise, sort of the realist, power-based relationships, you can get a good deal, but it's going to be fleeting. It's transactional. If you want to maintain a long-term collective security arrangement, such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, why is it an indispensable alliance? Why is it such a strong alliance? Because of the shared values. understanding each other's concerns and perspectives is critical to making that a strong alliance. And if you lose that, it won't be as effective. There's also a lot of work out there from the former U.S. aid community, in fact, that empathy-informed approaches to dealing with radicalization, whether foreign or I would argue domestic as well. When we understand the legitimate concerns of those we may violently disagree with, then I think we can stem extremism.
Can I jump back in with one more
Sure.
Absolutely.
note off of Mark's comment? So I do a lot with the U.S.-Japan alliance, since Mark brought up, and I take my some of my students who are lieutenant colonels and colonels or foreign service officers in a master's program. And I take them to Tokyo every year, and to Mark's point, we talk about the U.S.-Japan alliance from a national security perspective is really kind of the cornerstone of the United States engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. And yet, the more we talk with both American practitioners and Japanese statespersons and others, they're now becoming a little bit more concerned because the number of exchanges between Japan and the United States has started going down for lots of reasons. Part of it was COVID, et cetera. But now, if people are looking out into the future, they're thinking we've had this amazing relationship, U.S.-Japanese relationship over the last 70 years that we've built up, that's really kind of standing for, we think, to be a force for good in the Indo-Pacific region, looking out for kind of a rules-based and a values-based way of having states interact with one another. And they're worried that all those people-to-people connections that underpin the security relationship, if we don't start to revamp those, then it could really kind of crumble a little bit. Because as Mark said, you've got it. National security, it all involves people. We can talk about states and we talk about these abstract concepts. When it comes down to it, it's the people that make things come alive. And so just to reinforce Mark's point that even things like alliances, we've got policymakers that are thinking through, how can we get high school students to re-engage more? How can we get more business people to re-engage more so that we can have lots of people invested in why this relationship and those values that we stand for, why they're important? So thanks for letting me chime back in.
No, I love that. The people as both in a positive sense of alliance building, and then people also in terms of countering violent extremism and radicalization. And so we know that Bridge USA is powerful enough to work in both directions. I'm curious, obviously, one of the signature parts of Bridge USA and J1 visas is that they're in person, right? It's not some online Zoom call that students attend, much as we love them like this one. But is there something about that in-person interaction that particularly influences participants and Americans around those relationships? And Mark, I'm going to start with you because I picked on Sonya enough.
No problem at all. Look, I think some of this is similar. I think that it's that personal exposure that can help dispel the negative stereotypes. We were talking about nuance as well. As you meet individuals, you realize that not everybody from a particular place has the same point of view. You even may start to realize that accents, as the United States becomes slightly less accented regionally. You might start to understand idiomatic phrases. You might start to understand that communities have different ways of looking at things. So I think there's nothing to substitute for that personal interaction. Now, I'll also say in a digital world, this is particularly important. Even within the United States, young people, and I'll make that, let's say, high school through college and college age as well, are doing so much online. And I'm not saying that is a bad thing. Look, the commercial environment is the same as well. We have meetings online, we do webinars online, but it's that personal interaction that allows for not just the business to be taken care of, but the socialization afterwards. I know Sonya knows this, the best part of big conferences is not necessarily the panels, it's the coffees and the networking in between. And the equivalent of that may be not just what you're doing on your student exchange, maybe it's educational focus, work focus, but it's going to pick up your dry cleaning. It's going to the local coffee shop. It's seeing what people do on the weekends. And I think, that is so critical because, not to rehash this, but it creates that empathy. It creates a longer term bond as well, because there's something in it that is not transactional. It's not about the business you are there to conduct.
Sonia?
Yeah, and I just say to the last point about the transactional piece, I love the fact that we all got really good at Zoom over the last few years, and it opens up audiences and it opens up communications that we otherwise wouldn't have. So that's a positive side for it. But often it is very kind of transactional. It's set and defined times. We're going to schedule this meeting for this long. And so again, the word that comes to my mind is the organic sidebar conversations and the non-transactional parts of engagements. I think those are hard to replicate. I bet almost everyone online here has at some point over the last 5 or 6 years attempted to do a Zoom happy hour with groups, right? And you can try and they can be fun, but if you're all in person and everyone's talking over each other, somehow that works, at least in my family. We start talking louder and the table gets messier, but somehow you see it all. And it doesn't really come across on Zoom in the same way. And so I'd say in person is so important. And Mark even mentioned beginning with soft power, the allure of Coca-Cola or the allure of Hollywood. And we've got all these digital mediums that can show American life, that can, inadvertently reinforce stereotypes and not show the complexity, not show that everyone who lives in New York City is not exactly the same, that shoot, living in the city itself, you've got so many different ways of life, amongst the 10 million people on that one particular plot of land. But so I'll stop because I'm just now starting to repeat myself. So I reiterate Mark's point.
I think that's wonderful because it is a nuanced, unscripted, unplanned interaction that even with other kinds of exchange programs where it's much more formulaic, BridgeUSA exposes you to things that you may not have anticipated or that your host may not have anticipated in good ways and bad ways. Mark, you mentioned regional accents and the joy that is the myriad of American accents, and I'm hiding mine at the moment. But do you think that an improved understanding of English among J1 participants advances US soft power, adds to that decoding of the United States, and thereby contributes to national security?
I do. That's the short answer. And I want to approach this in a couple ways. What's coming to mind is I keep thinking about what I was taught years ago about cross-cultural communication, that you don't just have cultural barriers, you have linguistic barriers as well. And again, to understand the people and the language they're using, to understand the dialogues and the debates, and then from a U.S. perspective, to help further this free exchange of ideas, that's part of the soft power bit. Language skills are absolutely critical. I'm not sure if this applies, but since we're using some examples, I was trying to think of rock and roll during the Cold War. I mean, I know how important it was in transmitting the message, also the idea of rock and roll being liberating and being radical and rebellious. But particularly in Eastern Europe, American rock and roll was so important. But interestingly enough, some of the listeners didn't always speak English, but they knew the words to the songs. They knew how to sing the songs, even if that was the only English they had. But I think more specifically, what an understanding of English amongst the J1 participants can do are a couple things. One, if you speak the language, and this actually goes for Americans traveling abroad as well, you have direct access to original sources. And I know we can use Google Translate and things like that. It's not always the same. Not everything's going to be online as well. But academic papers, policy documents, but it's without the translation filters or bias. So we know that there's. I'm trying to think of a good example, but in the United States, it's difficult enough to understand the difference between happy and glad. But if you start to understand when you don't have to translate, it becomes a little bit easier to understand the meaning. you can get exposure to dissenting voices, things that reveal the internal debates and controversies, which again is a sort of a flip side of the regional piece. You have to understand this nuance as well. And guess what? It's unmediated interactions with people from in the other country. So in this case, with Americans, an authentic conversation with people to understand their perspectives. I also think that, again, I spoke about nuance, but I also think it really helps to understand complex debates. Now, I try and follow, I focus right now on political warfare and disinformation. And I will tell you, it is much easier when I can read a document in the original language, even though my translation abilities in French are not that great, than using Google Translate or getting the American translation of it because it misses some of the. I think, especially with American society, you'll miss some of the contradictions you have within documents and political discourse and social movements. So, and then finally, you know, I think that there's something about developing your own humanistic inquiry, your own research, using American archives in particular, which aren't always digitized, rather than just relying on the guided narratives.
That's great. Sonia, anything to add?
Sure. So I am a constructivist art. So I'm a firm believer that language shapes the way that we think, that it isn't just a mirror to reflect a given reality out there, right? And so the importance of being able to communicate with others, and actually I'll flip, when you ask that question, I'm going to flip it around really quickly and then come back. I thought of when I was a high schooler, I was an exchange student in both Germany and Japan at two different times on short different exchanges and learned the language. And I remember coming back home. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm hiding my accent. It comes out when I'm really tired. Came back home, and I remember saying to my mom, I can't believe that most Americans don't speak a second or third language. And I remember my mom said, okay, but Sonya, when you were in Europe, if you drove for 5 or 6 days, how many languages would you come across? A lot. And you learn German. And she's like, in the United States, I can drive for weeks on end and still be in the exact same country. So I remember she told me, so geography also can matter in that regard. And that we have lots of different, as Mark even mentioned, going back to our regional, we got lots of different dialects and different regional nuances just in the United States, but for the most part, English and Spanish now. And I never learned Spanish. I learned German and Japanese. Didn't help me here on my own continent. But that made me really appreciate just one. I mean, because we could lament that Americans, why don't we learn other people's language? Geography is one reason why Americans really are, speak English or Spanish for the most part. And then going back to where I started, I think language shapes how we think. And so when visitors learn English, there are certain words that we use in English that don't have direct translations in other languages, right? And you can really understand then Americans and what they're feeling and how they're thinking about things if you can understand the words that we use and the words that really are meaningful. And then you can get to all the scholarly things that Mark talk about. But that is definitely something we even do within the national security realm. With our different allies in many of our different alliance relationships, English is the primary language of record from NATO. It's one of the languages there to our alliances in the Indo-Pacific. And it's a way to make sure, again, that we communicate those shared values and make sure we do have that basic understanding. So learning that language helps people think more critically. You can get to kind of the next layers of how people live their lives if you can speak if you can speak English and engage with us. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, friends, I'm about to open the floor up to all of you for your questions, so please feel free to put them in the chat. I do have one that was submitted during registration, so we'll start there, but please do type away. So the first question that I have is from Jacob, and he's curious, what roadblocks do you see, particularly with this current political transition time that the US is in, around exchange programs and particularly around the messaging for exchange programs? And Sonia, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so why don't I talk about some of the messaging? I think Mark knows a lot more about the specific nuances from positions he's had on the logistical or the technical details, but I think roadblocks. I think on the messaging of how important, we're with the idea of visas starting to be kind of curtailed or it's harder to get through and to get to the process. Um, One, I'd say that notwithstanding all of the different cuts that are going on in the Department of State, one of the areas they have not cut is the consular section, right? And those are the people that do all of these processing. So we know that the processing of getting people across different borders is still remains a core function. Notwithstanding, again, I've got a lot of colleagues who are undergoing some professional roadblocks as well, to use that particular word. So I think one of the important things is just the fact that we can do messaging and we can talk about the importance at lots of different levels. So you phrase this particular session as linking the J1 and the local experiences to the national security, right? And so part of the messaging can just be the importance of what these programs mean at the local level, right? What do those students or those young professionals or those professors, what do they do and how do they enhance those local areas where they be going? Right. And I think that can be a really important messaging. Why is it valued there? Notwithstanding some of the different political discussions that are going on, perhaps at the national level. So I think in terms of messaging, you get over some of those roadblocks if you focus in on the practical local benefits to both the people that were coming on the J1 visas and the local communities that will be welcoming them in. And with that, I'll turn to Mark.
Yeah,
I love it. That was a nice commercial for Capital. Sonia, thank you. Your check's in the mail. Sorry, Mark, go ahead.
no, that's right. I'm going to sound a bit pessimistic here. I think the basic problem is that the current administration doesn't see the immediate value for us. They want some short-term impact. You come here and then you immediately invest in something that creates jobs and creates political clout for the administration. They don't believe in building for the long term. For them, the long term is, how much clout can they create for them for their own use in the next 4 years. And I'm sorry if that sounds a bit harsh, but that's the way I have seen it, both in terms of where they wanted to go the first time they were in office, and certainly where they're going now. I think there's also, as we know, both anecdotally and to some degree, based on what the stated policy is, um, increasing hostility towards foreign visitors. I mean, we should have a red carpet out for those who are coming to us, not secondary screening for everyone. I think that there's also concern over freedom of expression. If you come here and expect academic freedom, which is a cornerstone of why we have universities and what should be done at universities, but if you say something that's out of favor with the administration, you may find your visa revoked. And then finally, I actually do think the consular cuts are coming. The suggestions that U.S. consulates abroad may be cut, that some countries won't need embassies. Let's wait and see where that goes. I'm hoping that there's some sort of congressional intervention on this, but again, it may seem like it's saving us money, but it's not. It's really but I just don't see this administration looking at anything that's long term. They're simply looking at a snapshot of a balance sheet on a day-to-day basis, and they just don't think what this will look like or do to the United States over the coming years.
Can I say one more thing,
Yeah.
Carmen? Just the fact that, okay, so I work for the government, so I can't come across as too pessimistic right now. So yes, I agree with some of the statements that Mark said, but I'd say, cultural exchanges for those people who have been believers or participants before, we've always had a bit of an uphill battle trying to show over the decades what's the value. And the value is often in the long term. And so we've had that kind of conundrum for quite a while. But I'd say in this political environment today, Mark brought up the word congressional intervention. You were talking about state, but I'd say in my mind, that goes back to the importance of your local partners. And if this is important to you, this is the time when Americans need to activate all those good words of values and democratic processes, and they should contact their congressional representatives and talk about how important it is to their local needs and what they get from it to get that groundswell, right? So it's got to start from the bottom up, where all of these exchange people come, and then that could exert pressure on this particular administration as well. Anyway, that's my advocacy point for the day.
And we know there are some great efforts underway on that front. We know there are everyday statistics like the $1.7 billion, I think it is, contributed to the US economy. So there's that nice mix of long-term and short-term benefits of BridgeUSA in a very strategic, short-term, cut and dry kind of way. And we have time for one more, and I'll ask each of you to keep it a little tight because we're almost at time. Bettina was curious where you see the limits of soft power, especially in a multipolar world where other actors like China and Russia are also doing cultural diplomacy, but with very different narratives and potentially very different intentions. So, Mark, I'm going to start with you.
This is a little tougher. I I just want to kind of go back to the big picture. And I know this isn't gonna be exactly on point, but I just think broadly it's incredibly important to understand that what makes the United States an exceptional nation is our national character, that we are trusted in the world, we are seen as a reasonably neutral broker. We have our interests, we have our influence, we are open to other ideas. The nation was built on bringing people in. I was thinking about this the other day about American nationalism versus nationalism around the world. And we're not a homogenous society by any means. I mean, we're an amalgamation of so much over so many generations. You go back, take a look at the demographics of the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, and the 20th century, and it's almost like a kaleidoscope. America is always changing. And again, without sort of accepting that the value here is more holistic. It's not just about higher education. It's not just about advancing, as I suggested before, some sort of building long-term economic relationships, promoting democratic values. That it's really about who we are, a place where not only is there a free exchange of ideas, but where we want to promote that abroad. That we want to make sure that other nations take on take on these characteristics as well. Again, sort of a side approach, but that's just what I've been thinking listening to the conversation.
So I'd say yes, in today's competitive information space, I'll quote Joseph Nye one more time so I can tell I'm coming down on the end of the academic year. And there's a paradox of plenty, right? There's so out there, so many different voices that now we're really competing for people's attention. But I think that's why even more today than in other times, soft power and the attractiveness and values as lived by real people, the authenticity and the credibility that come across in short-term exchanges speaks so much more than just official messaging and all the voices we hear from Russia and China and everything else. And so I'd say, even just earlier, a few minutes ago, we talked about, yes, when we have face-to-face engagements, and you might hear and see things that don't necessarily even reflect immediately positively on the United States, but they're authentic. And we show that we can have differences of opinions or differences of agreements. And that's part of life. And that's part of how Americans in local communities live. So I think that authenticity and that credibility can still be very attractive, even when we're competing in this really complex information environment. So that would be my answer to that one. Good question.
And I think that's a wonderful distinguisher too between the US and other countries who may be less open to just turning hundreds of thousands of people loose across their nation to interact every day. Well, thank you so much to both of our speakers. Before our participants or our attendees head out, I've got one very quick poll for all of you. So please do let us know how we did here in this session. And while we do that, I have a couple of quick commercials. Capital members, and those who wish to be Capital members, which I hope is all of you, next Tuesday, May 20th, I am excited to announce a special conversation with Deputy Assistant Secretary Rebecca Piscini. So it's going to be a wonderful chance for Capital members to interact with her, to ask questions, and to talk about some of these issues that we've touched on today. If you're not yet a Capital member, as I mentioned earlier, it takes 5 minutes or less. But if you do want to be a part of that conversation with Deputy Assistant Secretary Piscini, you do have to join. We're going to have lots of other great content coming up. In June, we're going to be looking at those cultural exchange pieces, one of those things that really makes BridgeUSA distinct even from other visa types, and how you can easily bring that into your work, your host business, your host family. We're going to be talking throughout the summer about lots of other components under that wonderful umbrella that we have here at Capital around education, best practices sharing, and storytelling. So I'm so grateful to all of you for joining us today. Thanks for sticking around a couple of extra minutes. And thank you so much to Mark and Sonya for all of your great insights. It's not every day you go from ancient Greece to the UDHR all the way up to Joe Nye and soft power and combating misinformation. So thank you. And my hope that all of you will leave this session with some great takeaways you can use as you tell the story of BridgeUSA. This session will be live on the Capital YouTube page. And as I always do for Capital members, we'll have our easy handout that you can use to reference back as you try to make that case, try to tell that story, try to share this messaging, whether you're in the US with your elected representatives or you're overseas trying to talk to participants and alumni about why this is such a great thing that they should engage in. So thanks to all of you for being a part of our session today. Thank you to our speakers, and I look forward to seeing you at the next Capital webinar.